So, I just finished Atomic Heart, and I have some thoughts about it. Primarily, where the hell are all the women? Assalamu alaikum, comrades, I'm Izdihar, and if you don't know, I'm a Soviet historian, so when I started posting about how I completed Atomic Heart, many of you requested I do a review on it, and I'm not really going to go into extreme detail. Overall, it was a fun game. I really enjoyed the gameplay. I do like the characters. I know the dialogue is kind of cringy, and it's just fantastic to be able to play as a proud Soviet citizen who stands for the motherland. That's a really unique experience, and it's not portrayed in a way that he is evil for being that way. So I really enjoyed this new perspective of just being a citizen of the Soviet Union, albeit an alternate reality, and the visuals of that were just great. I'd been following the development of the game for the past maybe 4 years, so I was super excited to finally get my hands on it. And of course, as a historian, there were quite a few things that stuck out to me that were frustrating, especially in the timeline. While I know that it's an alternate reality and things have progressed faster than in the actual world, it was just kind of frustrating for my brain to be hearing about, for instance, space travel in the 1950s. And I think when I got to the part where you meet the Tereshkova bot and you need to put together her friend, and they explain, oh, I'm modeled after a famous cosmonaut. That's when my brain clicked and I started being a lot more critical of the game, because how is that a compliment? How is that honoring Tereshkova, the first woman in space, which of course in our reality didn't happen until the 1960s, but apparently it happened before 1955 in the game. And to honor the first woman in space, you turn her into a robot that looks nothing like her. In fact, looks more like a blow-up doll, and follows your every command. By the way, Tereshkova is still alive. Her politics are interesting. And she doesn't look anything like this robot, but at this point of the game is when I was like, fuck, where are all the women? Because it became very prominent in my brain in realization that every single woman in this game is either a subservient robot that are all weirdly sexualized. Of course, you got the babushka, and then you got a neurologist, a doctor. Granted, her whole character point is being a girlfriend, and throughout the game is called a bitch and a whore, despite being literally the kindest and most caring, compassionate character in the game. But other than that, what do you got? You don't even see female workers that have been casualties. You see the occasional female mutant, but even then it comes with its problems. So let's get into that. So let's begin with the reason why they have robots. The whole point of having robot workers doing unskilled, very unskilled labor, I hate that they use that term, is because of the casualties from war and the plague or sickness that happened, right? And in that case, wouldn't there be more women than men left? Just like after the real World War II. So first and foremost, the demographics that should be there based off of the mass casualties the Soviets had in this reality, but also in the actual reality, means that there should be more women than men walking around as casualties in the game and just around. But there aren't. There really are not. And based off of the sexualization of the women in the game and the female robots, it made me wonder, what is it? Is it that working women aren't sexy enough for a video game? Why would they not include that? Especially when in the reality of the Soviet Union, especially in the 1950s, whose female equality was an envy towards women all over the world, to the point that various conferences and discussions were happening around the success that the Soviet women had in their equality in the workplace, in everyday life, and in politics. When you have this particularly equal society and envy of the world in that respect, and to just leave that part out of 1950s Soviet Union is kind of odd to me. This book was printed in 1956 called Equality of Women in the USSR. It includes the materials and speeches from a conference that took place, an international seminar in Moscow, September 15th to October 1st in 1956, where women from all over the world came to the Soviet Union to hear about the achievements that Soviet women have made for themselves, the statistics, the happenings, reality of life for women in the Soviet Union, and they were also there to answer any question, and a lot of tough questions are asked. So firstly, in the Soviet Constitution, in Article 122, it says that women in the USSR are accorded equal rights with men in all spheres of economic, state, cultural, social, and political life. Now, the first chapter of this book goes into the political life of Soviet women. They say Tsarist Russia, where both social and national oppression were at their worst, was necessarily also a country of crying inequality of women. Old Russian legislation regulated women in both society and the family to a status not only unequal, but downright humiliating. Then, speaking on the Soviet Union, the first Soviet constitution, passed by the Fifth All-Russian Congress of Soviets in July 1918, legalized women's new political rights by proclaiming in Article 22 the equality of all citizens of the Soviet republics, regardless of sex, race, or nationality, and establishing in Article 64 the woman's right to elect or be elected to Soviets, which Soviet means council, on an equal footing with men, regardless of nationality, creed, etc. On April 11th, in 1921, the Council of People's Commissars, now the Council of Ministers, decreed that all institutions and industrial undertakings must introduce a new method of training large numbers of women workers and peasants into the work of the Soviets. The decree drew a tremendous number of women into the work of the local Soviets. In the second half of 1921, the Petrograd City Soviet, for example, promoted 793 women to permanent work and 4,660 to occasional work in government agencies. As the Soviet state developed and strengthened, women played a more and more important role in government and public affairs. By the end of the first decade of Soviet rule, the number of women deputies to the city and town Soviets was 21,221. To the rural district Soviets, it was 45,741, and to the village Soviets, 146,251. The radical changes brought about by the early five-year plans, the industrialization of the country and collectivization of its agriculture, drew more and more women into socially useful work and governmental activities. Article 137 of the Constitution says women have the right to elect and be elected on equal terms with men. Our state not only proclaimed this right, but made it possible for women to exercise it. In 1939, when elections to local Soviets were held under the new electoral system for the first time, as many as 2,154,688 members, or 34.1% of the total membership of the electoral commissions, were women. In 1955, the year that this game takes place, the respective figures for the same territorial, regional, city, district, and village electoral commissions were 2,899,325 and 41.3%, which meant a 7.2% increase in the proportion of women. The women's share in commissions for elections to the Supreme Soviets of the Union Republics and the Soviet Union is nearly as great. So nearly half of the elected officials of Soviets were women by 1955. Is that reflected in this game? As I mentioned, the Tereshkova bots kind of look like blow-up dolls, and of course serve your every whim. Then there's the vending machine or upgrade machine, which has some very interesting dialogue, as we know, extremely over-sexualized and asking to be controlled, and even abused sometimes. Of course, it's consensual on her part, but that representation is quite questionable given the setting. When speaking about Russia before the revolution, in accordance with the code of laws of the Russian Empire, the husband was considered the head of the family and the wife was obliged to obey him implicitly. The law endowed the husband with unlimited power over his wife. She had no right to take on a job or to enter an educational institution without the husband's permission. She had to take her husband's family name, and nobody even asked whether she consented to it. However, already in December 1917, decrees on marriage and divorce were signed by Lenin. These decrees abolished all the rules which led to the enslavement of women in the family and which placed them in an equal position. It was established that henceforth only civil marriage would be acknowledged in the Russian Republic. This measure was connected with the separation of the church and the state proclaimed by the Soviet power and was aimed at protecting the free woman from any possible restrictions of her rights by canon law. In February of 1920, Lenin wrote in his appeal to working women that the Soviet power was the first and the only one in the world to have abolished all the old laws, placing woman in an equal position with man, and granting man privileges, as for example in the sphere of marriage laws or in his authority over the children. Lenin further stated that the Soviet power, the first and only power of the working people in the world, abolished all the privileges in the sphere of property relations, which had been preserved for the husband by family laws in all other countries, even in democratic republics. Lenin realized that a legislative proclamation of equality of rights between men and women meant only the preparation of a building site, but not the building itself. In the course of the development of our state, the Soviet government has created all conditions which are necessary to make equality of women, civil rights included, an actual fact. So there was massive efforts to get rid of these old ways of life where women were subservient. So I just find it like doubly heinous that women are put in the subservient role explicitly in this game in an era of such extreme attempt and practice at female equality in the Soviet states. When posting about my discontent on Twitter, someone responded to me saying, "The game has 88 men in the staff and only 11 women from what I heard. It uses the women as robots, so it sounds more acceptable to objectify them." For me, it is just basically pure American fascism usurping the Soviet aesthetic and imposing the American imperialist ideology. And I think the Soviets in 1955 would agree with that statement. Now let's look at one of the game's main characters, Dr. Filatova. Of course, she is described as being a top-notch neurosurgeon and a talented employee at the Academy of Consequences. Dr. Filatova is a specialist known for her intelligence and subtly manipulative behavior. Interesting that they included that in her description. After her mentor's death, she continued to work on integrating humans and machines into Collective 2.0 network. Okay, so let's look at her character design. She looks pretty cool. I wouldn't say this is a 1950s outfit, especially not the shoes. And this is something I noticed throughout the game, is that all the characters that were women, of course, other than the babushka, all the like mutated women and Filatova, they all had high heels that are not even from the 1950s. But again, we're not really going with actual 50s fashion here, are we? And there are many scenes where she's running, and I don't know how she does it, but her butt is very prominently like shown in different scenes. Like she bends over a lot, and there's just a lot of focus on it. I looked, I'm sure everyone else was looking too. But like her point in the game is being one of the proposed antagonist's girlfriends. And that's literally her plot point. Yes, she's a doctor and she tries to save people, but that's not really so important to the story. The important part is that she's someone's girlfriend. And she is called so many like heinous things by people, despite being the only one who's actually very compassionate and is trying to heal and save people regardless of the side that they are on. The weirdly sexual masochist machine calls her a whore because she is jealous that P3 is spending time with her or talking to her based on nothing, you know. Yeah, let's just throw around calling the only female characters a whore. And even her own boyfriend calls her a bitch for not returning his phone calls, despite literally minutes earlier expressing how she is everything to him and he cannot live on without her. She is then called a bitch again after she throws a grenade to stop more inhumane stuff happening to an already dead body. Again, arguably a good thing that she did, but you know, she's a bitch, despite again being the kindest spoken person in the game. As I mentioned, I didn't see very many like bodies throughout the game that were actually women, other than a few of the mutated humans. And of course, when you actually interacted with and fought the mutated women, they would move in a way that their skirts and coats would fly up so you could see underneath them. And they also were wearing very impractical heels. So, great. And then I said, like, you know, you never really saw dead bodies that were women, but later on in the game, you come into a lab where there's a bunch of almost naked, they're in like their underwear, just women strewn across the lab in these preserved liquid tubes and on tables. And so the only time where you prominently see women as casualties, they're practically naked. Interesting choice. And then later on, you see more women practically naked when they are showing the volunteers of the collective project that have all been turned into this like hive mind controllable thing. So again, yay, more female representation, but of course they're, all their clothes are gone. And while I think characters like Babushka Zina are really cool, like I love her character, I love her personality, I love her part in the game, like the only positive example of a woman you can have is in a grandmotherly figure who is still in this role as a caretaker and watcher. She provides you with tea, she provides you with weapons, she provides you with information, she is caring for you. So in a way, even Granny Zina is subservient to man. Fun stuff. So I just thought all of that was something worth highlighting in case other people aren't as educated or aware of the stance of the Soviet Union in the 1950s, also being looked up to by feminists around the world for what they had done for women at that point in time in history, and just how the way women are represented and treated in the game don't add up to that. And yes, while it's an alternate reality, like the history is different, achievements in space have happened 10 years before they did in reality. There's weapons and guns that weren't like invented until the 1970s in the game. There's cartoons that are featured heavily that were from way later on in the Soviet Union. I really enjoyed the poster art, especially in the theater, but a lot of that is from all over the place, not just the time periods they're talking about, and sometimes way before the 1950s, so it wouldn't be hung up at. But again, I get it. Alternate reality, they're taking lots of different inspiration, and it did ultimately create something aesthetically really cool. A lot of people were concerned it would be super anti-communist, and I wouldn't say that it is. I think Dr. Filatova says a lot of anti-communist things near the end and associates like the main project of the game that was being created. They associate that with communism and that being negative and just like collective thought. Overall, it's not overtly anti-communist, but I do think that this kind of stuff makes my job as a Soviet historian even more difficult, because if people are being introduced to the Soviet Union and Soviet history and the Soviet 1950s for the very first time in a game like this, they can't differentiate what's fact and fiction. And when you have the treatment of women being more aligned with the reality in the United States and the Western world and the misogyny there, of course, misogyny existed in the Soviet Union. Just because laws were in place and opportunities were there for women doesn't mean that misogyny didn't still exist. Old habits from before the revolution and just people growing up maybe in more rural places where these new ideologies were slower to take root. But in general, it was far better than the Western world, and to make them go backwards in this game, in this alternate reality of history, to that of the hypersexualization of women in, for instance, 1950s America, or today, how we sexualize women today, it's just insulting and stupid and unnecessary, and I don't understand it. Other than the game was created by mostly men, and working women on equal footing with men aren't sexy for video games, I guess. Anyways, what did you think, comrades? Did you play the game? Did you notice these things too? Is anyone else talking about it? I don't know. Those are my main thoughts. Sorry it's a little brief and not super in detail, but I just wanted to get that out there. Thank you for watching, and be inspired by history. Okay, goodbye.